Well, thank you, Ron. I was hoping to get by all day without that leaking out. And yes, I am 25 for the 20th time today. Yes, yeah. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome here. And want to just welcome our friends from Teen Challenge. That was the band. There's a group of them here. As always, it's great to have you guys here. We love having you guys. Joel and Mandy, thanks for all you're doing for the kingdom in Mali. This is great. It's great to have you. And I have not met you yet. I hope to do that wherever you are. I think you're out there somewhere after the service. Thanks for all you're doing, and welcome back. Well, I'd like to start our time this morning by having you imagine that you are an actor and that you were given a part in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as Peter or Lucy. The director gives you your script with your lines and your movements highlighted for your ease of learning. But now imagine that instead of studying that script, you spent most of your time reading and rereading the script of Grease because it's just more interesting to you, and one day you're hoping to get cast as Danny or Sandy. Yes. Oh, Dan. Bowman wants to be Danny. Does that make you Jenny? No. Okay. She's giving a hard no. But just imagine that if you spent all your time in Grease, but you were cast as Peter or Lucy. And then what would it be like at that first dress rehearsal of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? The director would not be too pleased as you wanted to run with the T-Birds or the Pink Ladies through the city streets instead of running with fawns and beavers through a snowy forest. I mean, it's pretty funny, right? It sounds bizarre because we know it wouldn't happen. Because the best actors, we know, best actors, they always immerse themselves in the greater story they're cast in. And the more immersed they are in the story, the better they reflect what the author of the book or the director of the play or movie had in mind. You see, without being fully engaged in the greater story, it's almost impossible to play the true part. Well, as you may or may not know, we are working through God's story, this one story about God's great love for his creation. And before we get fully going this morning, I need to give credit where credit is due. You'll see on your bulletin on the bottom there, my three primary guides, Marty Solomon, Tim Mackey from the Bible Project, and Ray Vanderlaan. These guys are all so very helpful in staying connected to the bigger story of the Bible as a whole. Now let's do a quick recap of where we have been so far. It's been the Bible's introduction, the book of Genesis. Now, many folks call the first 11 books of Genesis the prologue, and in it we're introduced to the primary actor, God. We learn that this God speaks, and when he speaks, he creates, and what he creates is good. From the very first scene, we learn that this is a God who brings order to chaos. And much like Aslan isn't a part of every scene of the Narnia series, we as the readers know he is always there. He's always present somewhere. And the same is true about the God of the Bible. He doesn't show up in every scene of every story, but we come to know that this God is always at work. If not on center stage under the spotlight, he's always at work in the background. And since God spends large chunks of time backstage, he casts other real-life actors to play a part. And that's us, humans. He calls humans, the very best of his creation, to help tell his story. And so we met the first of these humans, Adam and Eve. And while God invites these two to live in the greatness and the goodness of the garden, a seed of doubt is planted in their mind by God's adversary, the accuser, as he is known throughout the rest of the story. And this accuser, in his very first scene on stage, accuses the good God of holding out on Adam and Eve. And this plants that seed of doubt in their mind, and over time, the seed of doubt matures into a tantalizing piece of fruit. And so the human actors choose to trust themselves, their own instincts, their own desires, their own thoughts, instead of trusting the one who put all the good together. And in that moment, evil was introduced. Chaos is invited back into the storyline. It's the beginning of the tale of two kingdoms, a tale that continues to this day. It's the conflict between the kingdom of order and the kingdom of chaos. And from this point forward, what we see throughout the rest of this story is humanity's struggle to trust. Will humanity trust this God who brings order and who is good? Or will they turn away from him and trust themselves and allow chaos to invade God's order? And now we saw how this led up to the flood story that involved Noah. Then in the last part of the prologue, we saw humanity doing this again as they tried to make a name for themselves by building a tower in Babel. And it was after this that God called Abram. And then from Genesis 12 to Genesis 50, we followed a family line: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Jacob's 12 sons and their families. It is one story after another of this one extended family. And they're consistently trusting their own instincts and their own desires, ultimately leading to a story full of chaos. Yet, in spite of their continual chaotic choices, God had the same response over and over. It was the offer to restore order to their chaotic lives. And when the biblical storyteller brings Genesis to a close, he records Joseph saying this to his brothers: "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Now, the NIV translation here can be a tad misleading. The word for harm is actually evil. The ESV translates it, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." This is an intentional connection back to the Garden of Eden and the earliest standoff between good and evil. Now, as the reader, as we prepare to move ahead in this book into the body of the book, we are supposed to have a very specific lens on our eyes. The God of this book and the creator of the universe is always about bringing good, about restoring order, even when his people, his chosen real-life actors of the story, time after time after time, choose the opposite. And with that, we're ready to jump into the body of the book, which starts in Exodus. The introduction left us in Egypt with Joseph. God had brought his people down to Egypt, and they were living in the land of Goshen, literally some of the most plush land in the entire world. We are later told in Exodus that 400 years go by. But we are also given a heads up that this was coming back in Genesis 15, when God was making his covenant with Abram. This is what God says to Abram back then in verse 13. "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there." Well, we are now at the end of those 400 years in our story today. But to me, what was really intriguing was the "know for certain" language. The Hebrew is the word yada, which means to know intimately, the way Adam knew Eve. But not only that, the Hebrew here doubles up on the verb. The "for certain" in English is actually the command form of the verb yada in the Hebrew. So this could literally be translated, "knowing you must know." It's the equivalent of using bold, italics, underlines that we do today. So as the stories are repeated from Abraham's generation down, the Israelites are to intimately know for certain that hard years are ahead. But they are also to understand that this God will not abandon them, even in their darkest days, because God foretells this hardship in the context of the covenant. Let this remain on your back burner as we continue. I'll be pulling it back forward later. Jumping back to Egypt at the end of the 400 years of suffering, God's people were living out one of the original commands given to them in Genesis. We read in Exodus 1:7 that the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. This is another blatant act of intentional connection back to the creation narrative. But then we learn of a new development, a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. This is the author's not so subtle way of alerting the reader that trouble is brewing. Now here we can pause and see the stages being set. The kingdoms of order and chaos were lining up for a duel. The entire book of Genesis took us back and forth between order and chaos, good and evil. And now 400 years have transpired, and we have a new scene and a new threat of chaos. And it's the kingdom of Egypt. God's people have been drawn into the chaotic scene of the Egyptian narrative, and it's a completely different story. It's a story of a chaotic battle of multiple gods, always at war to get their way. And what we learn from the other parts of the biblical story is that the Israelites slowly but surely become assimilated into the Egyptian culture. And this meant more than just their clothes and their food. They began to worship the Egyptian gods as well. I think this is a great spot to pause and make sure we think on this for a few minutes. You might have heard the analogy of the frog in the pot of water, right? He gets plopped in a pot of water at room temperature. Then the heat gets turned on. The water temperature slowly rises, unbeknownst to the frog, because he's comfortable and has grown accustomed to the water. And sure enough, it's not long before he's cooked. This is what happened to the Israelites in their 400 years in Egypt. They slowly but surely assimilated to the Egyptian culture around them, which included the worship of their gods. Israel was stuck in the wrong story. And you know what got me thinking? Is it possible that we could be stuck in the wrong story ourselves? Is there a chance that we, you and I, are being groomed into men and women that look more like the culture around us than the God who has rescued and redeemed us? Let me answer that question for you. Absolutely. It is absolutely possible that we are the frog in the pot. Have our advances as a society brought more order to our world? Do you feel more engulfed by chaos or order? Brothers and sisters in Christ, listen. What happened to the Israelites in Egypt can definitely happen here. Do not be mistaken. We may live in the land of religious freedom, and we can gather together like we are right now without threat. But if you do not think that the gods of materialism, the gods of autonomy, the gods of comfortability, the gods of complacency, if you don't think that these gods are at war within us, well, we better look around, because the water in our pots might be at a full boil. The gods around us are promising us order, but they only deliver chaos. We are most definitely at risk of being stuck in the wrong story like Israel was. So let's continue on and see what God does to rescue his people out of the wrong story. It would be a terrible story if it ended here, but it doesn't, and neither does ours. Right? We have read that the Israelites are multiplying, so much so that the Egyptians are actually scared of them and that they might revolt. So the king, the Pharaoh, attempts to have all the Hebrew boys killed. And it's at this point we are introduced to Moses. And a few months into his life, in an ironic twist, he gets placed in the same river that Pharaoh wanted boys like him killed in. The irony continues as Pharaoh's daughter pulls him out. And as a result, Moses finds his way into the home of the most powerful man in the world. Just like God took the chaotic pieces of Joseph's story that we saw last week to eventually lead him into Pharaoh's palace to rescue and restore order to Israel, we now see God use Pharaoh's daughter to pull Moses out of the chaotic waters of the Nile, only to place him into Pharaoh's palace, where he would later return to restore and rescue and bring order to Israel again. And it's amazing. So the story continues and records Moses seeing an Egyptian beating a Hebrew man. Moses kills the Egyptian, and he flees to the wilderness for 40 years. Then later, there was a specific event back in Egypt that led God to call Moses from the wilderness back to Egypt. Let's look at Exodus 2, verses 23 to 25. During that long period, the 40 years that Moses was in the wilderness, during that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. So the Israelites cried out, but pay particular attention to the fact that they simply cried out. There was no mention to whom they were crying out, like we hear often throughout the greater narrative. The author is making a bold admission by omission here. He purposefully does not use the verb that say he cried out to the Lord or to God here. Because after well over 400 years of assimilation to the Egyptian culture, they just simply cried out. They had forgotten their story. They had forgotten their God. Yet that God heard their groaning and saw their suffering. And with his eyes and ears being triggered, God remembered the covenant he made with their forefathers. You see, our God hears our cries, he sees our suffering, and he remembers his promises. Agreed. This is not a God of wood or stone. This God speaks, this God hears, and he remembers his covenant. And this is the covenant that Pastor Ron highlighted a few weeks ago in the Abraham story. And it's also the covenant that we looked at a few minutes ago. And remember, while making this covenant hundreds of years earlier, God also foretold the 4 centuries of slavery. And he used the verb yada. You can pull that back off the back burner now. He used the verb yada to encourage his people to know for certain these days would come. And here now in Israel's darkest hour, not only does their God see them, hear them, and remember his covenant, he reminds them that he knows them intimately. Now, we don't see it in the NIV translation in the verses we just looked at, but the word translated concerned at the bottom of the screen is actually yada, to know intimately. This God sees his people. He hears his people. He knows his people. And he knows they need him. The time has come for God to rescue his people. So he calls Moses out of the wilderness after 40 years of shepherding excuse me, to return to Egypt and rescue God's people. All right, at this point, I'm going to turn to Tim Mackey and his video from the Bible Project to neatly summarize some of what happens next.
In the famous story of the burning bush, God appears to Moses and commissions him to go to Pharaoh and order him to release the Israelites. And God says that he knows Pharaoh will resist, and so he will bring his judgment on Egypt in the form of plagues. Then God also says that he will harden Pharaoh's heart. And so we're introduced into the next main part of the story, the confrontation between God and Pharaoh. Now, what does this mean, that God says he'll harden Pharaoh's heart? It's super important to read this section of the story really closely and in sequence. In Moses and Pharaoh's first encounter, we're told simply that Pharaoh's heart grew hard. There's no implication that God did anything. And so in response, God sends the first set of 5 plagues, each one confronting Pharaoh and one of his Egyptian gods. And each time, Moses offers a chance for Pharaoh to humble himself and to let the Israelites go. But after each plague, we're told that Pharaoh either hardened his heart or that his heart grew hard. He's doing this of his own will. And so eventually, it's with the second set of 5 plagues that we begin to hear how God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So the point of the story seems to be this. Even though God knew that Pharaoh would resist his will, God still offered him all of these chances to do the right thing. But eventually, Pharaoh's evil reaches a point of no return. I mean, even his own advisors think that he has lost his mind. And it's at that point that God takes over and bends Pharaoh's evil towards his own redemptive purposes. God lures Pharaoh into his own destruction as he saves his people, which is what happens next.
So these guys do a really great job with these Bible Project videos. I really highly recommend them to you. But let's fill in a few spots of the story from the video. First, I really love what he does with the hardening of Pharaoh's heart in the video. You know, this section is a place of significant tension for many Western Christians and non-Christians alike. Wrestling with this point of tension at the level it deserves would require an entire sermon or Bible study all on its own. So we simply don't have the time for that today. But one of the things that I did not know until studying for this sermon is that there are actually 3 different Hebrew words translated harden in our English Bibles during this story. So clearly there is something beneath the surface of all this hardening of Pharaoh's heart business. And if you'd like to geek out on this a bit more, like I do, I love geeking out on this stuff, I've made a document that highlights the different uses. It's out in the back. I also have it online. You can email me, and I can email it over to you. But it's fascinating stuff if you're kind of a nerd like me. Anyways, jumping back to the story. The time had come, right? The time had come for the king of the kingdom of order to break into the chaos of the kingdom of Egypt. And he does so through the plagues. And while there are a number of different directions to go with the plagues, we're only going to address them from a higher altitude this morning. And one of the main points of the plagues from the big picture perspective is that everyone would know that the Lord is the king in control. See, he wanted the people to know that he was God. So let's take a look at what God says to the Israelites in Exodus 6, verse 7. He says, I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I mean, that makes sense, right? God wants to save his people, remain true to the promise he made to their ancestors. So he wants them to know, or yada, that's the verb we're tracking today. He wants them to know that he is the Lord, their God, that he alone is their rescuer. And this fits the biblical narrative pretty tightly, right? But we need to remember that this God is different than the gods of the surrounding culture. So perhaps God is up to something else as well. So I want to look at a few verses right before the plagues begin. Exodus 7:5 says, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring the Israelites out of it. You see, this God who made humanity in his image, not just the Hebrews, this God has a heart for the Egyptians. His heartfelt hope is that as the Egyptians watch what is about to unfold before them with the plagues, that they will know, or yada, same verb, that the God of Israel is the one true God, and that the ways of Pharaoh and the polytheistic Egyptian narrative is not the true story. But then we have the character of the unnamed Pharaoh. While he too is made in the image of God, he bought into his own strength and his own glory, to the point where the reader knows where his road is leading. But was God's heart solely bent on the destruction of Pharaoh? Well, let's look in the text to find out. God tells Moses to tell Pharaoh, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has sent me, Moses, to say to you, Pharaoh, let my people go, so that they may worship me in the wilderness. But until now, you have not listened. This is what the Lord says. By this you will know that I am the Lord. That I am the Lord. You will know that I am the Lord. With the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water of the Nile, and it will be changed into blood. 3 verses after this, the plagues start. Hopefully you caught what Moses said on behalf of the Lord there. By this you will know. Yada. Again, God wants everyone to intimately know that he is the Lord. That is a main point of the plagues. Why were there 9 plagues before the literal death blow of the 10th? Well, I think it was that so everyone in Egypt, the Hebrews, the Egyptians, and even Pharaoh himself would have ample opportunity to see all that God was doing and know that he was the King of Kings. And of course, we know how the story unfolds. The plagues begin to play out, and as the video mentioned, they were designed to take aim at the Egyptian gods. These plagues were direct attempts to communicate to Pharaoh, the Egyptians, and the Israelites who were now worshiping these gods, that the Israelite God had everything under his control, even the many gods of Egypt. You see, God's story is the true story. Israel's God is the one true God. And then it came time for the 10th and final plague. And by this time, God had hoped there was enough evidence out there for everyone to pick a side. Will they side with the king who oversees the kingdom of chaos, or will they choose to side with the king in control of it all? And now as readers, we are to wonder, would God's children remember their story? Would they remember the stories orally passed down through the generations about how this God made a covenant with their ancestors? Would they remember those stories and realize that they were now on the center stage of this same story? You see, their God had set a plan in motion to save them, to rescue them out of the shackles of slavery. And this plan began with a family feast. We refer to it as the Passover meal. And it continues to be celebrated by Orthodox Jews today. And it was the same meal that Jesus, with his disciples in the upper room, were celebrating on the night he was betrayed. But now on the night of the original Passover, there was a literal life-saving action that needed to be taken. The Hebrews needed to slaughter a lamb and put the blood of the lamb on the doorposts of their homes. And those with the blood of the lamb on their doorposts would be saved from what came next, the 10th and final plague. The Lord says in Exodus 12:12, "On that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals. And I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord." All those in Egypt, without the blood of the lamb on their doorposts, and I think this might mean those Israelites that were not trustworthy enough to jump back into God's story potentially, but all of those in Egypt, without the blood of the lamb on their doorposts, would see the death of all their firstborn. And this would be God's way of executing judgment on all the gods of Egypt. Notice that God's judgment was ultimately against the gods of Egypt, not the political entity of Pharaoh. The political fight has never been and never will be the Lord's primary fight. On the night of the Passover, lines were drawn and sides were picked. There was no hiding one's allegiance anymore. If you wanted to pledge your allegiance to the God of order, the good God, you would have blood from the lamb on your doorpost. And if you didn't, you wouldn't. And there would be mourning in the morning. You see, God knew his people, saw the afflictions of his people. He heard their cry. He remembered his covenant, and he rescued them. He stepped onto center stage under the spotlight for all to see, and he rescued his people. And now all of this was just a foreshadowing of the greatest rescue mission of all time. When our earliest ancestors invited chaos into God's ordered creation, evil entered the picture. And evil's greatest weapon, death, became God's biggest enemy. And we are all plagued by this death. So much so, we all end up enslaved by its relatives in our time on earth. Depression, anxiety, lust, addiction, anger, pride, and the list could go on and on and on and on. We end up enslaved by these things, trapped in the kingdom of chaos, until that day comes when we finally cry out, "Oh God, save me." And our God hears us, and he sees us. He knows us intimately, he remembers his covenant, and he rescues us. You see, God's ultimate rescue plan involved him stepping back onto center stage in the middle of history to defeat his greatest enemy, death, once and for all. And this time, he would take on flesh himself. The Father sends the Son, Jesus, under the spotlight. And Jesus lives the life none of us can ever live. He enters this world of chaos and lives a perfect life of order. And he becomes the spotless Lamb. He goes to the cross. His blood is spilled on behalf of all humanity. And those who call out to him, recognizing him as the Son of God, are metaphorically covered by his blood and are rescued from eternal separation from God after death. This is the new covenant God made with all humanity through his firstborn. And Jesus is beckoning us to come and follow him. And we need to follow his call back into his story. We must remember the story. We have been rescued to live in God's kingdom of order. And one way we remember the story of our rescue is by celebrating communion together, which we'll do next. As the band comes up to lead us in song, let me ask those of you who know Jesus, who are covered by his blood, do you feel like you're trapped in the kingdom of chaos? Is that how you feel this morning? Well, remember, you have been rescued from that kingdom. Come back to Jesus today. He is the answer to our chaos. The answer to our chaos is not in a political platform or any other worldly entity. The answer is Jesus. Return to Jesus. And for those of you who have not come to a life-changing faith in Jesus, you need to know that he died in your place on that cross. He has executed his plan to rescue you out of the world's chaotic kingdom. And he is inviting you into his kingdom of order. If you would like to accept Jesus' invitation into his story and would like to accept his rescue plan, come find me or another pastor after the service, and we would love to pray with you. As the band sings this next song, for those taking communion, come to the front during the song to get the communion elements. And as you do, as you hold the elements, let me invite you to remember the story, and remember God's great love for you. At the end of the song, I'll come up to lead us in communion.